Good evening, my dears, and welcome back to our fireside once again. Outside, the snow is falling soft and silent, and there is nothing quite so lovely, or quite so deceiving, as a manor house dressed in white for Christmas. The holly is hung, the goose is roasting, and somewhere beneath all that warmth and candlelight, an old grudge has been waiting patiently for its moment. Tonight, we return to St. Mary Mead, and to a certain elderly lady with sharp blue eyes and a fondness for her knitting, who has been invited to spend the season at a grand old manor, and who will, before the pudding is even served, find herself in the company of a murderer. This is the manor's White Christmas murder, a tale of family, of silence, and of the sort of poison that does not come in a bottle, but is bred slowly, over many years, at the family table. So do settle in with your tea, and if you enjoy an evening spent unraveling a good, honest mystery in the company of dear Miss Marple, I should be ever so grateful if you'd give this video a like, and perhaps leave a word below telling me who you suspect before the end. Now, do put another log on the fire, my dears. It is time we began. The manor in snow. The snow had been falling since Tuesday, and by the time Miss Marple's train drew into the little station of Lower Fenwick, the whole of the Kentish countryside lay hushed beneath a coverlet of white, so that hedgerows and fields alike had lost their edges and become one soft, unbroken sheet, rolling away to a colourless sky. She was met on the platform by a young man in a heavy driving coat, who introduced himself, somewhat breathlessly, as Gerald Ashworth, and who informed her that his aunt had sent the car, and that it was a most frightful business getting up the hill in this weather, and that he did hope she would not mind if they went rather slowly. "Not at all," said Miss Marple placidly, settling herself into the car with her small case and her knitting bag. "I find that going slowly is very often the wisest course, in weather and in other things." Gerald glanced at her sideways, as though uncertain whether this was meant to be amusing, and then, deciding it was safer to laugh, did so, and put the car into gear. Ashcombe Manor, when at last it came into view through the softly falling snow, was everything a manor house ought to be at Christmas time. Grey stone walls silvered with frost, tall chimneys sending up thin ribbons of smoke into the dusk, and lit windows glowing amber against the coming dark, so that the whole house had the look of something upon a Christmas card, cheerful and welcoming, and entirely without menace. Miss Marple, however, had lived a good many years in St. Mary Mead, and had learned, in that time, that houses which looked most like Christmas cards very often had the most interesting things going on behind their curtains. She was welcomed at the door by her hostess, Mrs. Constance Ashworth, a handsome woman of some 60 years, upright as a poker, who took both of Miss Marple's hands in hers with every appearance of warmth, and declared that it was too good of her to come all this way, and that the family would be simply delighted to have a fresh face about the place this Christmas, for they had none of them been getting on terribly well of late, though of course Constance did not say precisely what she meant by that, and Miss Marple, who had learned long ago never to press for information that was being offered up freely, merely smiled and said how very kind it all was, and allowed herself to be shown up to her room. It was a pleasant room, done in faded chintz, with a small fire already lit and a view, from its mullioned window, over the white lawns to the frozen lake beyond. Miss Marple stood at the window for some minutes before she began to unpack, watching the last grey light fade from the sky, and thinking, as she often did upon arriving at a new house, that there was something to be learned from the way a family arranged itself at Christmas, who sat where, who spoke to whom, and who, more tellingly, did not speak at all. She was to have ample opportunity to observe this, for dinner that evening brought the whole of the Ashworth family together for the first time, and Miss Marple, seated modestly near the foot of the table between the vicar's wife and a deaf old cousin, was very well placed indeed to watch them all. There was Constance herself, presiding with the brisk good humour of a woman determined that Christmas should be a success, whatever it cost her. Her husband, Colonel Ashworth, a large, florid man who ate a great deal and said very little. Their elder son, Hugh, who would one day inherit the estate, and who wore the slightly harassed look of a man doing sums in his head that would not come out right. His wife Diana, a pretty, restless creature who laughed rather too readily at things that were not, Miss Marple felt, especially amusing. The younger son, Peter, home from London for the holidays, thin and watchful, with the particular quietness of a man who has a great deal to say and has decided to say none of it. And lastly, Hugh and Diana's daughter, a girl of perhaps 20 called Rosamond, who sat very straight and very pale and hardly touched her soup. "You must forgive us if we seem a little subdued," Constance said to Miss Marple over the fish course, in the bright voice of a woman determined to explain away what could not in fact be explained away. "It has been rather a trying year for the family. My brother-in-law's affairs, you know, but I mustn't bore you with all that." "Not boring at all," said Miss Marple gently. "Family affairs are never boring, Mrs. Ashworth. I find they are generally the most interesting thing about a house." Constance laughed, a little too brightly, and changed the subject to the excellence of the goose that had been ordered for Christmas Day, and Miss Marple, buttering a small piece of bread with great attention, allowed her eyes to travel once more down the table, to Hugh, frowning at his plate, to Peter, watching his brother with an expression Miss Marple could not quite name, though she thought privately that it looked very like old grief that has curdled, over time, into something closer to resentment, to Rosamond, who once, when her grandfather addressed her sharply about sitting up straight, flinched as though she had been struck. It was, Miss Marple reflected, going to be a very interesting Christmas. She said as much, that night, to the vicar's wife, a comfortable woman called Mrs. Latimer, who had also been invited for the season, and who occupied the room next to hers. "Interesting, Miss Marple. I should have said it was rather a sad house, if you want my honest opinion. There's something not right in that family, and has been for years, though I couldn't for the life of me tell you what." "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, looking out at the snow, which had begun to fall again, softly, silently, covering over the marks of the day, as though nothing at all had happened. "No, I don't suppose you could, but I dare say we shall find out before very long. These things," she added half to herself, "have a way of coming to the surface, particularly at Christmas." The gathering. Christmas Eve dawned bright and bitterly cold, with a sky so blue and a sun so dazzling upon the snow that it was difficult, looking out of the window, to imagine that anything unpleasant could ever happen in such a place. Miss Marple, who had risen early from long habit, took her breakfast in her room and then went down to the morning room, where she found Mrs. Latimer already established by the fire with a piece of embroidery, and from that excellent vantage point the two ladies were able to observe a good deal of the household's comings and goings without appearing to observe anything at all. It was Peter who came in first, still in his outdoor things, stamping snow from his boots, and he had barely settled himself with the newspaper when Hugh appeared in the doorway and stopped short at the sight of his brother, so that for a moment neither of them spoke. "I didn't know you were coming down for the holly," Peter said at last, in a voice that was perfectly pleasant, and yet, Miss Marple thought, not pleasant at all underneath. "Someone has to see to it," said Hugh, "since you were too occupied in London to trouble yourself with the arrangements." "I was occupied earning my living," said Peter, not looking up from his paper, which is rather more than can be said for some people who inherit theirs. "That will do, both of you," said Constance, sweeping in with an armful of greenery and the particular brightness of a woman who has heard this exchange, or one very like it, a great many times before, and has grown practised at smoothing it over. "It is Christmas Eve, and I will not have quarrelling. Peter, be a dear and help your father with the tree." Peter went, though not before Miss Marple caught the look that passed between the two brothers, a look that had, she felt, a good deal of history behind it, and none of that history pleasant. "They were always close, as boys," Mrs. Latimer murmured, once the room had emptied, bending low over her embroidery. "I remember them at church, thick as thieves, the pair of them. It's the money that's done it, if you ask me. Money, and old Mr. Ashworth's will." "Ah," said Miss Marple, taking up her knitting. "There is a will, then." "There's always a will, in a house like this," said Mrs. Latimer darkly, and would say no more on the subject, though Miss Marple, who had not survived 70-odd years in St. Mary Mead without learning how to wait, felt fairly confident that more would come to light before the day was out. More did come to light, though not in the manner Miss Marple had anticipated. In the early afternoon, walking in the garden to take a little air, for she found that a short walk after luncheon was most beneficial to the digestion, whatever the weather, she came upon Rosamond sitting quite alone upon a stone bench beneath the bare branches of a great cedar tree, apparently indifferent to the cold, with an expression upon her young face that Miss Marple did not at all like to see there. "You will catch your death, my dear, sitting out here without a coat," she said, settling herself, with some care for her rheumatism, upon the other end of the bench. Rosamond looked up, startled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she would simply get up and go, as young people so often did when an old lady showed signs of wishing to talk to them. But instead the girl remained where she was, twisting her gloved hands together in her lap. "I don't much mind the cold," she said. "It's better out here than in there. Family gatherings can be very trying," Miss Marple agreed comfortably, taking out her knitting, for she had found, over a long life, that people spoke more freely to a woman who appeared to be occupied with something else entirely. Especially when there is an old unhappiness in the house that nobody quite likes to mention. Rosamond was silent for a long moment, watching the needles click. "It's Uncle Peter," she said at last, in a rush, as though the words had been waiting some while for permission to come out. "He and Father haven't spoken properly in, years, not since Grandfather changed his will. Everyone pretends it's nothing. But it isn't nothing, it's—" She stopped herself, colouring. "I oughtn't to be telling you this. I'm sure it's none of my business, and even less of yours, Miss Marple, if you'll forgive me saying so." "Not at all, my dear," said Miss Marple placidly. "I am a very old woman with very little to occupy me beyond my knitting and my garden, and I find other people's business a great deal more interesting than my own. But you needn't tell me anything you don't wish to. I only observe that it is a great pity for a family to be unhappy at Christmas, of all times, when it is meant to be a season of goodwill." "Goodwill," Rosamond repeated, with a small, unhappy laugh that had nothing of amusement in it. "There's precious little of that in this house, whatever Grandmother likes to pretend. You wait until this evening, Miss Marple. Uncle Peter's got something up his sleeve. I can feel it. He's been looking at Father all day like a cat that's found where the mice are." She stopped again, as though startled at her own frankness, and got up rather quickly, saying she must go in and help her grandmother with the decorations, and left Miss Marple alone upon the bench with her knitting and her thoughts. Miss Marple sat a little while longer in the cold, for she found that a garden, however bare and however frozen, was often a very good place in which to think, and there was, she felt, a good deal to think about already, though it was early days yet, and she was the first to admit that early impressions were very often wrong ones. She thought of Hugh's frown, and Peter's watchfulness, and the girl's frightened, unhappy face, and the odd, brittle brightness with which Constance Ashworth seemed determined to paper over every crack in her family's Christmas. "A cat that's found where the mice are." It was a curious phrase for a granddaughter to use of her own uncle, and Miss Marple, gathering up her knitting at last and making her way back towards the warmth of the house, found that she did not much like the sound of it at all. That evening, before dinner, the whole family gathered in the great drawing-room for sherry, beneath a tree hung with candles and old glass ornaments that had, Constance informed the company with determined cheerfulness, been in the family for 3 generations. It ought to have been a pleasant scene, and to a casual eye, no doubt, it was, the fire crackling, the candles glowing, the snow falling softly beyond the tall windows. But Miss Marple, accepting a small glass of sherry she had no particular intention of drinking, noticed that Peter stood a little apart from the rest, watching his brother with an expression that had, beneath its careful blankness, something almost like triumph, and that Hugh, catching that look across the room, went rather pale and set down his glass, untouched, upon the mantelpiece, and that old Colonel Ashworth, warming himself before the fire, remarked to no one in particular that he did not know what had got into the boys these days, but he supposed they would settle it between themselves soon enough. He was not, as it turned out, very far wrong. But he could not have known, saying it, how very soon, nor how very final that settling would prove to be. After lunch, Christmas Day came in clear and cold, with a hard frost silvering the lawns, and the household rose to the particular bustle of a great house determined to keep every one of its old traditions: carols before breakfast, the giving of small gifts, a walk to the village church through snow that crunched pleasantly underfoot, and, at 1:30, a luncheon of such traditional splendor that even Miss Marple, who prided herself on a modest appetite, found she had eaten a good deal more than she had intended. It was, on the surface, a merrier meal than the dinner 2 evenings before. The Colonel carved the goose with a great show of ceremony. Constance had put on her better pearls and seemed, for the first time since Miss Marple's arrival, genuinely content. Even Hugh appeared to have shaken off some of his gloom and made an effort to be pleasant to his brother across the table, an effort which Peter, for his part, met with a coolness that was courteous enough on the surface, but which did not, to Miss Marple's observant eye, suggest any real thaw beneath. It was towards the end of the meal, over the pudding, that the trouble began. Quietly at first, so quietly that afterwards no one could quite agree on how it had started. "I understand," Peter said, setting down his spoon with what struck Miss Marple as rather deliberate care, "that congratulations are in order, Hugh. Mr. Fenwick tells me the sale of the North Farm went through very satisfactorily last week." There was a small, curious silence. "I don't know what business that is of Fenwick's to discuss," said Hugh, and his voice had gone flat and careful in a way that made Rosamond, sitting beside him, look up sharply from her plate. "No business at all, I should think," Peter agreed pleasantly, "except that it was grandfather's land before it was yours, and I rather fancy grandfather had certain ideas about what ought to become of it when the time came. Ideas that I don't believe he ever quite got around to writing down properly. Which is odd, don't you think, considering how careful he generally was about such things?" "Peter," Constance's voice cut across the table, bright and brittle, "not at table, please. Whatever you and your brother have to discuss, I am sure it can wait until after Christmas." "Can it?" said Peter, and for just a moment the pleasant mask slipped, and something harder showed through. "I wonder. I've been rather patient, Mother, this last year and more. I begin to think patience has done me very little good." Hugh had gone quite white. He set down his napkin and rose from the table with a scrape of his chair that seemed, in the sudden quiet, unnaturally loud. "I think," he said, "that you and I had better have this out properly, Peter, and not in front of the whole family and our guests. If you'll come through to the drawing-room." "By all means," said Peter, rising also, with the same terrible pleasantness. "I've been wanting to have it out for rather a long time." The two brothers went out together, and the door closed behind them, and the luncheon party sat on in a silence that no one seemed to know how to break, until old Colonel Ashworth said, with forced heartiness, that boys would be boys, and it would all blow over directly, and would somebody pass the cream. Miss Marple, however, noticed that Constance's hands, folded in her lap, were gripped very tightly together indeed, and that Rosamond had not touched her pudding at all, and that Diana, Hugh's pretty, restless wife, was watching the drawing-room door with an expression of such naked apprehension that it seemed, for a moment, quite out of proportion to a mere quarrel between brothers. The party did not linger long over coffee. It was perhaps 3/4 of an hour later. Miss Marple, who had gone up to fetch a shawl against the chill of the hall, could not afterwards be perfectly certain of the time, that the household was disturbed by a sound that no one at first could quite place, a single sharp cry, quickly cut off, from the direction of the drawing-room. It was Diana who reached the door first, and Diana's scream, a moment later, that brought the rest of the household running. Miss Marple, coming down the stairs as quickly as her rheumatism allowed, arrived to find a scene of the utmost confusion. Constance clinging to the doorframe with her hand pressed to her mouth. The Colonel pushing past his wife into the room, his ruddy face gone the colour of ash. Rosamond frozen upon the threshold, unable, it seemed, either to enter the room or to look away from it. Beyond them, In the great drawing room, beneath the Christmas tree with its 3 generations of glass ornaments still catching the light of the fire, Hugh Ashworth lay upon the hearthrug, quite still, with a small dark stain spreading slowly across the front of his shirt, and his brother Peter, standing over him, white to the lips, staring down at his own hands, as though he did not know them. "I didn't," Peter said, to no one in particular, in a voice that did not sound entirely like his own. "I swear before God, I didn't touch him." It was Miss Marple, moving forward with a composure that surprised even herself, who knelt, with some difficulty, for her knees were not what they had been, beside the still figure on the hearthrug, and who confirmed, gently but without any doubt at all, what the stillness had already told the rest of the room. Hugh Ashworth was dead, and somewhere beneath the bright, brittle cheerfulness of that Christmas day, Miss Marple thought, with a small, cold certainty that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, the truth of what had happened here had already begun, very quietly, to take shape, though it would be, she suspected, rather a long time yet before anybody but herself began to see it clearly. Miss Marple considers. The next hours passed in the particular grey confusion that follows sudden death in a house unprepared for it. The local constable summoned from the village, and after him a police surgeon, and after him, in the early afternoon, a tired-looking inspector by the name of Bexley, who arrived stamping snow from his boots, and looking as though he would very much rather have been at his own Christmas dinner. The family had been gathered, with as much gentleness as the circumstances allowed, into the morning room, while the drawing room was given over to the business of measuring and photographing and murmuring that Miss Marple had, over the years, come to associate with sudden and violent death. She sat now in a low chair near the window, her knitting in her lap, though her needles were, for once, quite still, and watched the family as they waited. Peter sat apart from the others, his head in his hands, saying nothing. Constance had not wept. Indeed, she sat very upright, very pale, with the fixed, glassy look of a woman holding herself together by main force. The colonel had aged 10 years in as many minutes. Diana wept quietly into a handkerchief, and Rosamond sat beside her mother, white-faced, staring at nothing. It was Inspector Bexley, once he had seen the room and heard the first disjointed accounts of what had happened, who came to speak to the family, and it was from his questions, and from the answers given to them, that the shape of the thing began, slowly, to emerge. Peter had gone into the drawing-room with his brother shortly after the quarrel at the table. Voices had been heard, raised, though no one could say precisely what had been said. Some minutes later, the estimates varied between 5 and 15, which did not surprise Miss Marple in the least, for she had long ago given up expecting agitated people to be reliable about clocks. Peter had come to the door and called out, and when the others arrived, they had found him alone with his brother's body, a small ornamental dagger, one of a pair that had hung for years upon the wall above the mantel, lying upon the hearthrug close by. "I never touched it," Peter said, when the inspector asked him directly. "We quarrelled, yes, I don't deny that. About the farm, about grandfather's will, about a great many things that have been sitting between us for a year and more. But I left him alive, Inspector. I walked to the window. I remember standing there, looking out at the snow, trying to calm myself. And when I turned round, he was on the floor. You didn't hear anything. No one come in. Nothing. I know how it sounds. I know it can only have been me, by anybody's reckoning. But I did not do it." Miss Marple, listening quietly from her chair by the window, found herself considering the dagger, for she had, in the general confusion, been permitted a glimpse of it before it was taken away, and had noted, with the particular attention she gave to small and apparently unimportant things, that its twin still hung upon the wall above the mantelpiece, and that the wall itself, just there, bore a small mark in the dust where something had recently been disturbed. "Inspector," she said, when a pause in the questioning seemed to permit it, "I wonder if I might ask something rather foolish." Bexley, who had clearly been warned by the local constable that there was an elderly lady staying in the house with a reputation for cleverness, though he did not look especially pleased about it, turned to her with the weary courtesy of a man who has learned not to dismiss such offers out of hand. "Ask away, Miss Marple. Only, the dagger. It is one of a pair, is it not? I noticed the other still upon the wall. I wondered whether anyone had thought to ask when the two of them were last seen together, whether both were in their place this morning, for instance, before luncheon." It was, in fact, precisely the sort of question Miss Marple felt certain would matter a very great deal, and she was a little put out, an hour later, to discover that she had been mistaken, or very nearly so. The housemaid, questioned on the point, recalled quite clearly dusting the mantel that very morning, and could swear that both daggers had been in their place then. The difficulty was that she could not say with any certainty whether they had still been there after the family returned from church, a good 2 hours before luncheon, which left rather a wider window of opportunity than Miss Marple had hoped for, and taught her, not for the first time, that a promising question did not always yield a tidy answer. "Well, it was worth asking," she said to Mrs. Latimer afterwards, a little ruefully, over a cup of tea neither of them much wanted. "I confess I had hoped it might narrow things down rather more than it has. One does so like a nice, clear answer, but I find that life very rarely provides one, and I ought to know that by now." "You don't think it was Peter, then?" Mrs. Latimer asked, lowering her voice, though there was no one else in the small sitting-room to hear them. "I think," said Miss Marple slowly, setting down her cup, "that it would be very convenient indeed for someone if we all thought it was Peter. He was found alone with the body. He had quarrelled with his brother not 10 minutes before. He stands, I imagine, to inherit a good deal now that Hugh is gone, or at least to see whatever grievance he held put right. It is all quite tidy, and I have found, in a long life of observing my fellow creatures, that murder is very rarely as tidy as it first appears. People are untidy things, Mrs. Latimer, whatever they may wish us to believe of them, and families most untidy of all." She glanced towards the window, where the snow had begun, once more, to fall, soft and silent, upon a garden that had already, in the space of a single day, become the setting for something considerably darker than a Christmas card. "No," she said again, half to herself, "I do not think it was quite so simple as that, but I could not yet tell you why I think it, which is a very unsatisfactory position for an old woman to find herself in, and I do not mind admitting it." Family secrets unfold. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair, taken in near silence in the small breakfast room, for none of the family could bear the thought of sitting down in the dining room, with the drawing room standing empty and sealed just beyond the wall, its door watched over by a young constable who looked, Miss Marple thought, almost as unhappy about the arrangement as the family themselves. Peter had been taken to the village to give a further statement, and had not yet returned, and his absence sat over the table like an accusation nobody quite dared to speak aloud. It was afterwards, when the family had scattered to their various private griefs, that Miss Marple, walking slowly along the upstairs corridor on her way to bed, came upon Constance Ashworth, standing quite alone before a row of family photographs, a candle in her hand, though the electric light was working perfectly well. "I find I cannot settle," Constance said, without turning round, as though she had known who it was behind her, without needing to look. "I keep thinking I shall wake up and find it has all been a dream. Foolish, at my age, to think such things." "Not foolish at all," said Miss Marple gently, coming to stand beside her. "Grief does not consult our age before it visits us, Mrs. Ashworth." Constance was silent a moment, looking at the photograph nearest her hand. 2 boys, perhaps 10 and 12, standing on a lawn in old-fashioned sailor suits, arms about each other's shoulders, laughing at something beyond the edge of the picture. "They were not always as you saw them," she said at last, low. "I want you to know that, Miss Marple. Whatever this last year has been, they were the dearest of friends as boys. It was their grandfather who spoiled it between them." "The will," said Miss Marple. It was not quite a question. Constance's mouth tightened. "My father-in-law was not a kind man, whatever else he was. He liked to keep people uncertain of him. It amused him, I think, in his last years, to let both boys believe they might inherit, and to say nothing definite to either. When he died, the will named Hugh, as the elder, for the house and the land, as was only proper. But there had been things said to Peter before that, promises, hints, I never knew exactly what, that led him to expect a good deal more than he received. He never forgave Hugh for it, though heaven knows it was not Hugh's doing. And Hugh? Miss Marple asked. Did he forgive Peter, do you think, for believing it of him? Constance looked at her sharply, and for a moment something moved behind her carefully composed face, something that might have been fear, or might only have been an old and very tired grief. I don't know, she said. I have asked myself that a great many times this last year, and I don't know. I only know that I have watched my two sons grow apart, inch by inch, over a piece of land and a dead man's cruel little game, and now— Her voice broke finally, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, and Miss Marple, with the particular tact of a woman who had comforted a great many people in a great many kitchens and sick rooms over the years, said nothing at all, but merely stood beside her in the dim corridor until the worst of it had passed. It was Rosamond, the following morning, who provided the next piece of the puzzle, and provided it, as young people so often did, without in the least intending to. Miss Marple found her in the small conservatory at the back of the house, where she had gone, ostensibly, to look at Constance's rather fine collection of ferns, and where she came upon the girl sitting with a letter in her lap, staring at it as though she did not quite know what to do with it. I don't suppose it matters now, Rosamond said, when Miss Marple had settled herself upon the wicker chair opposite and made no move to ask what the letter was. I don't suppose anything matters very much, now that Father— She stopped and steadied herself and went on. It's from Father. He wrote it to me last week, when I was up at school. I only got it yesterday morning, before it happened. Would you like to tell me what is in it, my dear? You needn't, of course. Rosamond hesitated, and then, with the sudden decisiveness of the very young, held the letter out. You may as well read it. I don't know who else to show it to. I can't show the inspector. I don't know what he'd make of it, and I don't want them thinking worse of Uncle Peter than they do already, whatever he's done. The letter was a short one, written in a hand Miss Marple did not know, but which she took to be Hugh's own, hurried, a little uneven, as though written in some agitation of mind. It spoke, in guarded terms, of matters that must be settled before the new year, and of Hugh's intention to put things right at last, whatever it costs me, and ended with a line that Miss Marple read twice, and then a third time, with the particular stillness that came over her when something of real significance had at last presented itself. I have written to Mr. Fenwick to alter the arrangement, the letter said, and I believe your uncle will be very much surprised, and I hope, in time, a good deal happier when he learns of it. You see, said Rosamond, watching her face, Father was going to give Uncle Peter his share of the farm money after all. He told me so himself, at half-term. He said he'd been wrong to let Grandfather's old spite stand between them so long, and he meant to put it right before Christmas was out. He was going to tell Uncle Peter yesterday. That's what the quarrel was about. I'm almost certain of it. Not spite at all, but Father trying to tell him, and doing it badly, the way Father always did do difficult things badly, and Uncle Peter not believing him. Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment, the letter in her lap, the pale winter light falling through the conservatory glass upon its hurried, uneven hand. My dear, she said at last, I think you have just told me something very important indeed. I wonder if you would allow me to keep this letter a little while, not to give to the inspector, not yet, but simply to think about. I find that letters, like people, very often mean rather more than they say outright, and I should like to consider this one carefully before I decide what is to be done with it. The red herring. Peter returned from the village late that afternoon, grey with exhaustion, and looking, Miss Marple thought, very much like a man who had spent several hours being asked the same question in a great many different ways, and had found no way of answering it that satisfied his questioner. He went straight to his room without speaking to anyone, and it was not until the following morning, over a breakfast that nobody much wanted, that the household learned, from Inspector Bexley himself, who had called early and asked to see Constance privately, that a further piece of evidence had come to light, and that it did not look at all well for Peter Ashworth. "They found his handkerchief," Mrs. Latimer reported to Miss Marple afterwards, in the hushed, faintly scandalized tone of a woman passing on news she knows she oughtn't. "Caught on the corner of the mantel, quite close to where poor Hugh was lying. Peter says he doesn't know how it got there, but of course he would say that, wouldn't he?" "Would he?" said Miss Marple mildly. "I dare say he would, if it were true as well as if it were false. That is rather the difficulty with handkerchiefs, and indeed with most small evidence of that kind. It tells us a man was in a place, but very little about what he was doing there or when." But she noted, all the same, that the discovery had altered the temper of the house considerably. The Colonel, who had been inclined, the day before, to defend his younger son with a father's stubborn loyalty, now wore the strained, unhappy look of a man beginning to fear the worst. Diana had taken to her room with a headache, and Peter himself, when Miss Marple came upon him that afternoon, standing alone at the window of the library, looking out at the frozen lake, with an expression of such bleak despair that she felt her heart go out to him, whatever the truth of the matter, seemed almost to have given up the business of protesting his innocence, as though he had concluded that no one would believe him whatever he said, and had stopped, from sheer weariness, trying. "They think it's settled now," he said, without turning round, when she came to stand near him. "The handkerchief. I suppose it does look very bad. I can't even tell them how it came to be there, because I don't know myself. I only know I didn't touch him, Miss Marple, whatever anyone believes." "I believe you," said Miss Marple quietly. He turned then and looked at her with an expression of such startled hope that it was, she thought, almost painful to see. "Why?" he said. "Nobody else does. Not even my mother, I think. Not really, though she'd cut her tongue out before she'd say so." "Because," said Miss Marple, "a handkerchief caught on a mantelpiece tells us that you stood near it at some point, which you have never denied. It does not tell us when, and it does not tell us that you used a dagger, which is rather a different thing to establish, and which nobody, as far as I am aware, has yet managed to do to my satisfaction. I find, Mr. Ashworth, that when a piece of evidence arrives very conveniently, just when everybody has begun to feel that the case wants tidying up, it is generally worth asking oneself whether it arrived there by accident or whether somebody wished it to be found." Peter stared at her. "You think someone put it there, on purpose?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that I do not yet know enough to think anything very definite, and I should be doing you a great disservice if I pretended otherwise. But I will tell you this, Mr. Ashworth, since it may be of some small comfort to you. Your niece showed me, yesterday, a letter written to her by your brother shortly before his death, in which he spoke of putting right an old wrong between you before the new year. It does not read, to my mind, like the letter of a man who expected a violent quarrel. It reads like the letter of a man who expected, very shortly, to make his brother happy." Something in Peter's face broke, then, quite suddenly, and he turned back to the window so that she should not see it, and said nothing for a long while, and Miss Marple, who understood that there are moments when the kindest thing one can do is to say nothing further, stood quietly beside him and let the silence do its own work. It was that evening, however, that the case took a turn which Miss Marple had not at all anticipated, and which taught her, not for the first time, the folly of settling upon an explanation before every fact had been properly weighed. Diana, coming down rather late to the small, subdued gathering before dinner, white-faced and clearly labouring under some strong agitation, asked to speak to the inspector alone, and emerged from that interview, a quarter of an hour later, looking as though she had been physically ill, and would say nothing to anyone, only that she had told him everything, and that she was very sorry, and went straight up to her room without touching her dinner. "What can she have told him?" Rosamond asked, bewildered and frightened, catching at Miss Marple's sleeve in the corridor. "Mother's never had anything to do with any of it. She wasn't even in the room." "No," said Miss Marple slowly, watching the closed door of Diana's room with an expression of considerable thoughtfulness. "No, my dear, I don't suppose she was. But I begin to think that Diana knows something about that room, all the same, something she has been carrying alone for rather longer than tonight, and has only now found the courage, or perhaps simply the necessity, to put down the truth beneath the snow. It was not until the following morning that Miss Marple learned, from Inspector Bexley himself, what Diana had told him. For the inspector, whatever his early doubts about an elderly lady meddling in his investigation, had come by this time to a certain respect for her opinion, and sought her out, over an early cup of tea in the small morning room, with the air of a man glad of someone sensible to talk to. She says she saw someone, he told her, stirring his tea rather absently. Christmas Day, just before the two brothers went into the drawing room. She was crossing the hall and saw a figure slip in through the garden door, the one that opens onto the terrace, just beside the drawing room windows. She didn't think anything of it at the time. Says she assumed it was one of the staff. It was only after she understood how it must look for Peter, that she began turning it over in her mind, and grew frightened, and said nothing, because she couldn't be certain, and didn't want to send the investigation chasing after a shadow. And now she is certain? Miss Marple asked. Now, said Bexley heavily. She says she's fairly sure it was a woman's figure, in a dark coat. And there are only so many women in this house, Miss Marple. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment, her needles quite still in her lap, and found that it did not surprise her nearly so much as perhaps it ought to have done. She had, if she was honest with herself, been waiting for some while for a fact of just this shape to present itself, though she could not, even now, have said precisely why. Inspector, she said at last, I wonder whether I might ask you something, before you take this any further. The garden door Diana mentions, does it lead anywhere in particular? I ask, because I walked in that garden myself, 2 days ago, and I recall it leads past the old rose beds to a little gate, and from there, I believe, down towards the gardener's cottage. That's right. Why do you ask? Only that I had a conversation, on that same walk, with Miss Rosamond, in which she told me a good deal about the unhappiness in this family, and mentioned, I recall now, though I confess I did not think a great deal of it at the time, that she had lately taken to walking down to the gardener's cottage rather often. She said it was to see the puppies, Inspector. There has been, I understand, a litter born there just before Christmas, and young people are very fond of puppies. Bexley looked at her, faintly puzzled. I don't quite see what that has to do with anything, Miss Marple. No, said Miss Marple, with a small, troubled frown. No, very likely it has nothing to do with it at all, and I am simply an old woman who notices too many small things and cannot always tell which of them matter. But I find I keep returning to the dagger, Inspector, and to the mark in the dust upon the wall, and I cannot make it fit as neatly as I should like with what we have been told. If you would permit me, I should like, very much, to speak with Diana myself, and afterwards, I think, with Rosamond again. There is something in this house that has not yet been said outright by anybody, and I have a strong feeling that it is the thing which matters most of all. She found Diana in her room an hour later, still in her dressing gown, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, and it took very little persuasion, for the poor woman seemed almost relieved to have someone to talk to, who was not a policeman, to draw the rest of the story out of her. I didn't want to say anything, Diana said, twisting her handkerchief in her hands. I told myself I couldn't be sure, and that was true enough, but it wasn't the whole truth, Miss Marple. The whole truth is that I was afraid of what it would mean, if I said what I'd seen. Because I do think I know who it was. I've known really since the moment I saw her go in through that door, only I didn't want to know it. Rosamond, said Miss Marple gently. It was not by now very much of a guess. Diana's face crumpled. She'd had the most dreadful row with Hugh the morning of Christmas Eve. I don't even know what it was about. She wouldn't tell me. Only that she came out of his study white as a sheet and wouldn't speak to either of us for the rest of the day. I thought it was nothing. Young girls and their fathers. You know how they quarrel over the smallest things. But then I saw her, Christmas Day, going in by the garden door, not 10 minutes before it happened. And I've told myself 100 times since that it can't mean anything, that she only went in for a book or to fetch something, and came out again before ever Hugh and Peter arrived. but I haven't been able to make myself quite believe it, and it has been eating at me ever since, Miss Marple, until I thought I should go mad with not saying it." Miss Marple sat very still, turning this new intelligence over with great care, for she was conscious, now, of having very nearly made an error of the kind she most disliked in herself, of having allowed the shape of a suspicion to harden too quickly, before all the small, untidy facts had been properly weighed against one another. She had thought, only the day before, that she understood the pattern of this family's unhappiness. She saw now that she had understood perhaps half of it, and had mistaken that half for the whole. "Diana," she said at last, "I think you had better tell me exactly what you remember of that quarrel on Christmas Eve morning. Every word of it that you can recall, however small it may seem. I begin to believe we have all of us, myself very much included, been looking at this poor family's grief and seeing only the part of it that lay upon the surface." The reveal Miss Marple asked Inspector Bexley if she might gather the family together that evening in the drawing-room itself, a request which he met, at first, with some reluctance, on the grounds that it was hardly the pleasantest room in the house to choose for such a purpose, but to which he agreed at last, having learned, over the preceding 2 days, that Miss Marple's requests, however oddly phrased, were generally worth granting. And so it was that, as the light failed outside and the snow began once more to fall, the Ashworth family assembled beneath the tree with its 3 generations of glass ornaments, in the room where Hugh had died, and waited, with varying degrees of dread, to hear what the small, elderly lady with the knitting bag had to say to them. "I must begin," said Miss Marple, when they were all settled, "by confessing that I very nearly made a grave mistake. I had come, only yesterday, to suspect that Rosamond might have gone into this room on Christmas Day, that the figure in the dark coat which Diana saw was hers. I am glad to say I was wrong, and gladder still that I did not say so aloud before I had gone a little further into the matter, for it would have caused a great deal of quite unnecessary pain to a young lady who has already suffered a great deal this Christmas, and whose quarrel with her father, on Christmas Eve morning, had nothing whatsoever to do with what happened in this room, but was, I think I am right in saying, my dear, about a young man of whom her father did not entirely approve." Rosamond, scarlet, looked down at her hands and said nothing, which Miss Marple took, correctly, for confirmation. "No," Miss Marple went on, "the mistake I so nearly made was a very natural one, and it taught me something I ought to have remembered from the first, that 2 women, of similar height and build, wearing similar dark coats, may very easily be confused with one another in failing light, by a witness who was, in any case, more concerned with not being seen herself than with seeing clearly. Diana did not see Rosamond cross the hall that afternoon. She saw someone very like her. She saw, I now believe, Mrs. Ashworth. There was a stillness in the room of the particular kind that comes when everyone present has, in some part of themselves, already guessed what is coming, and is waiting only to hear it said aloud. Constance did not move. She sat very upright, as she had sat every day since Miss Marple's arrival, her hands folded in her lap, and said nothing at all. "I had thought, at first, that this was a story about 2 brothers," Miss Marple continued, "set against each other by an unkind old man's will, and I do not doubt that it was that, in part. But the more I considered it, the more I found myself asking a different question, not who had the most reason to quarrel with Hugh, but who had lived longest with the unfairness that began it all, and felt it most keenly, and had the least means of ever putting it right." She turned, gently, towards Constance. "You told me yourself, Mrs. Ashworth, on the landing, 2 nights ago, that your father-in-law was not a kind man, that he had let both your sons believe they might inherit, and said nothing definite to either, and that Peter never forgave Hugh for a wrong that was, as you said, not Hugh's doing at all. But I think, if I may say so, that you never quite forgave Hugh for it either, though you had told yourself for years that your anger was on Peter's behalf and not your own. You had watched your younger son go without, and your elder son inherit everything, and you had smiled and kept the peace, and told yourself that was simply how these things were arranged, in families such as this one, until, I think, you overheard rather more of the quarrel on Christmas Day than anyone realized. "I don't know what you mean," Constance said, but her voice had lost its brightness entirely and come out instead as something thin and exhausted. "I think you were passing the drawing-room door," said Miss Marple, "on your way, perhaps, to fetch something from the garden room beyond, and I think you heard Peter accuse his brother, once again, of having cheated him of what should have been his, the same old grievance you had listened to, in one form or another, for a year and more, until you could not, that day of all days, bear to hear it again. I do not think you went into that room intending harm, Mrs. Ashworth. I think you went in only to stop the quarrel, as a mother will, and that something in you, some very old unhappiness, some resentment you had carried so long you had stopped recognizing it for what it was, simply broke, all at once, at the sight of the dagger there upon the wall, so close to hand. I do not think, even now, that you fully understand why you did what you did. I think it was not planned, and I think you have been living, these 3 days, in a kind of horror at yourself that none of the rest of us can properly imagine." There was a long silence. And then Constance Ashworth put her face into her hands, and the sound that came from her was not quite weeping, but something older and more terrible than weeping, and when at last she spoke, her voice was so low that they all had to lean forward to catch it. "He didn't even know," she said. "That was the cruelty of it. I only learned it after, from Rosamond's letter, that he'd been about to make it right, that he'd meant to give Peter his share after all. I killed him for a wrong he was already trying to undo. I have lived 30 years watching my husband's father twist my sons against each other for his own amusement, and I told myself, every one of those years, that I bore it patiently, for the sake of peace. And I did not know, until I stood over my own son with that dagger in my hand, how very little patience I had left in me at all." She lifted her face, ravaged and old in the firelight. "I let Peter be suspected. I let my own boy be looked at as a murderer, and I could not make myself say the word that would have freed him, because I was afraid, because I am an old, frightened, wicked woman, and I did not want to die knowing what I had done." No one in the room moved to comfort her, and Miss Marple did not think, in that moment, that comfort was what was wanted. It was the Colonel who broke the silence at last, crossing to his wife's side and putting a hand, heavily, upon her shoulder. Not, Miss Marple thought, in forgiveness, for that would come, if it came at all, only very slowly and with great difficulty, but simply in the old, worn habit of 30 years of marriage, which does not break entirely, even at the last. Inspector Bexley, who had been standing quietly by the door throughout, stepped forward then, and what followed was quiet and brief and dreadfully sad, as such things generally are, and need not be dwelt upon here. It was some while later, when the house had grown very still, that Miss Marple sat once more by her bedroom window, looking out over the white lawns to the frozen lake beyond, now silvered with moonlight, and reflected, as she so often did at the end of these sad affairs, upon the strangeness of what she had seen. She thought of the old man who had died years before any of this began, and who had, out of nothing more than a cruel amusement in watching 2 boys hope and fear by turns, planted a poison that had taken 30 years to come fully into flower. She thought of Constance, smiling and pouring sherry and arranging holly, carrying that poison quietly within her all the while, and never once, perhaps, until the very moment the dagger was in her hand, understanding how deep it had gone. It was, she thought, rather like the garden below her window, so lovely under its coverlet of snow, so entirely at peace to look at, and yet holding beneath that white stillness all the old roots and tangles that had been growing there, unseen, for years, and would go on growing, whatever was built or said or forgiven above them, until they were dug out at last, into the light. She picked up her knitting, for she found that her hands wanted something to do, and outside the snow went on falling, soft and silent, upon Ashcombe Manor, and upon the sad, small human wreckage of a family that had wanted, more than anything else in the world, only to love one another properly, and had not, in the end, quite known how.